Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Lights on Data show. My name is George Firican, and today I'm very excited to talk about the future of work using predictive models in HR analytics. And to do so, we have Keith Goode, who's the Vice President of ZeroedIn. Keith, welcome to the Lights on Data show.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. And I'm so excited to address this topic. I feel like it's really on top of mind on a lot of companies. And I want to first get an overview of the predictive models in HR analytics and kind of the significance that you're seeing that they are shaping the future of our work.
Great. Yeah, I'd like to start by kind of identifying two main areas. One, advances in machine learning and AI really provided some algorithms that can address key concerns from an HR perspective, like flight risk and hiring models and so forth. And the second is a little bit more, shall we say, old schoolish, where organizing data, getting data prepared for introduction into a model. So
Hmm.
there's both areas require a level of effort. And it's great that these models are becoming a lot more easy to use and work with. However, there's still some challenges out there to be able to get data prepared for a model. And then, of course, the other challenge and level of effort comes into understanding what a model generates and how it can be used.
Right, right. And we'll talk about that as well. I have a couple of questions on it, but I'm very curious, really, from the experience that I'm having. Not that I'm HR, but
Mhm.
obviously, as an employee, I do interact with HR, and I feel like a lot of companies in HR they're having hurdles with workforce planning, with talent acquisition, with that employee retention that you're also mentioning. So, how would predictive models contribute to improving these HR hurdles?
Absolutely, and a lot of different ways. From that recruitment perspective, it's analyzing and utilizing that historical data about the candidates that have come through the front door, those that have been acquired or hired, as well as those that have been not, and of course, looking at long term to see who's worked out and who hasn't. So the challenge right there is looking at pulling data from two disparate siloed systems, bring it together. So that's the first key challenge. But once you get that together, you can look at those candidates and ones that have become hired and successful hired, and generate that through a model to help identify what are those components that can be used to help predict what is going to be a good hire and what isn't going to be a good hire, especially across job skills and organization. Even location could be a feature that goes into the model to help identify who might be better candidates. So that's one aspect. Another aspect, again, is looking at potential who might be at risk of leaving the organization or a flight risk. And we've generated models using historical data, preparing that data so that you can look at an individual person and maybe counting how many times they've been promoted or demoted or changed jobs or how many supervisors they have. All those are features or factors that go into the model that can then help predict, who might be at risk and who might not be.
Mm,
So those are two examples. We've also looked at generating models to help work in general. We've worked with call centers that had very specific skill sets and certifications so that when work came in, it had to be divvied up to the right people. So we looked at models that would score the work coming in and align it to people's availability and certifications that could work on specific tasks that came in. So a lot of great ways that AI can be used in helping the workforce become better utilized.
for sure. So I have to ask, especially on the talent acquisition strategy and model, there was this really great example that keeps getting cited from Amazon on how a few years ago they've implemented this AI model to, scour the vast number of resumes that they had in the past. And then based on that data that it used for training, it then applied to try and hire new employees for, I think, it was software programmer roles or something like that. And it found out that it had quite a bit of bias. Why? Because at least traditionally, a lot more men used to be hired for those type of roles. So then when the AI algorithm saw that, oh, it looks like there's a woman that's applying instead, it was downgrading the value of that resume, not considering it for the job at hand. So how do you ensure that there's like all these biases and ethical aspects kind of embedded in the work that you do?
Yeah, that's a really great point. And in fact, taking that a step further, there are some locations, some states, for example, in the state of New York, where they've actually uh, have new legislation that says if you're using AI for human workforce type things like recruiting and others, promotions or whatever, you have to audit to ensure the biases are removed.
Mm,
So, not only is it a good thing to do, but it's also in some state a legal requirement to do, which I think is fascinating. But, you know, bias analysis is critical in once you generate a model and you're evaluating that model for effectiveness, you also want to be able to do a level of bias analysis to ensure that the model will fit what you're trying to do. And we think that it doesn't necessarily have to be a legal element, but it is a good and a practice to follow when generating models. So looking at the features that go into the model and seeing if there's any bias, especially on personal factors such as gender or ethnicity, are things that should be considered when doing your bias analysis.
and I'm curious, usually, is HR in the loop? Is like the human in the loop, or are mainly data scientists that are kind of overseeing this? When you're
Another
working with
great question.
companies, do
Yeah,
you work closely with the HR
yeah,
departments?
absolutely. So I think in a lot of organizations, sometimes a request will come in to a data scientist that says we want to generate a model that does this, and then a month, 2 or 3 months later, you get this back, and that's a challenge. One, reading it and then understanding everything that goes into it. So I believe to be successful, having that business and HR element and understanding that model is critical throughout the whole process, not just throwing it over the fence for a statistician to do, but in that whole process of building out the model, identifying the features that go into it, the bias analysis, and then finally presenting the outcome. I mean, most models will generate a predictive value that's between, say, 0 and 1. Well, you don't want to present that to a manager. You want to then segment that into something more readable. Is it a high flight risk, a medium flight risk, a low flight risk? So you have to, then take those numbers and translate it into something that's more meaningful and displayable. Not only that, we've worked with something we call explainable AI. So at the end of the model, you get this prediction. Okay, this person's a high flight risk, medium or low, whatever it might be. And then our clients would often ask, well, why? Why is Johnny over here a high flight risk, but Susie over there is not? And with AI, the advantage is that it looks at every case and it's able to learn across your data model to make a better prediction. So each feature that goes into it could be weighted differently for each prediction. So we're able to then take a prediction and run it back through the model to say, okay, for this prediction, what were the features that were most highly used in generating the prediction? And then you can do that on each individual to help understand, why was this person rated a certain way and another person wasn't. So having that explainable AI is really important. And that gets back to your question in terms of, having the people in HR to be able to understand, from a statistician perspective, you might just say, column A was higher than column B, but it takes someone with that business knowledge to say, oh, okay, well, yeah, I see this pay increase definitely impacted their ability to stay,
Hmm,
where a numbers person is just looking at it from a number perspective.
right. So one of the other challenges that I'm thinking of in implementing this in certain companies is that they don't have the data necessary to be able to then build these models on top of that data. How do you work with that, or do you just work with companies that are maybe at a more mature stage in their data HR data practices?
Well, you'd actually be be surprised. Even some of the more mature organizations, it's not always not having the data. A lot of times, it's the data is spread across different places, and it's hard to bring it together. For
Right.
example, a normal organization in the course of 5 to 10 years, may have switched their payroll system twice. They may have introduced two new learning management systems. They may have a different performance management system across that time period. So the data is siloed not only in different systems, but within that silo, maybe even different systems over time.
Hmm.
So being able to one, if the data is there and it's siloed like that, you have to aggregate it. If the data is just, you're talking about a new organization that doesn't have the historical aspect of it, there are other aspects. You could look at Bureau of Labor statistics and others to generate some background data. But really, you do, to have a model that is designed for your organization, it really should come from that historical data.
Right. Do you also work with unstructured data? I would assume maybe from the resumes, from the applications.
Yeah, and also, unstructured data, especially from surveying perspective. You look at systems like payroll and HRS systems, you can come up with a lot of quantitative information, but pulling that qualitative information from surveys and being able to do sentiment analysis over top of that and drive that
Mm,
into a model is important as well. So yeah, we're looking at some of the unstructured data as well, to go into a model. I have to admit, most of our experience is, first utilizing that more structured quantitative information.
thank you. Can you please share some real world examples or success stories that you had where these predictive analytics models have led to, some tangible improvements in the HR processes and outcomes? And you touched upon the call center. Are there any
Yeah,
other ones that come to mind?
yeah, that one was pretty interesting. Being able to steer work to people that were both available and qualified to do the work was a really nice project. Another example I would come back with is flight risk, and we work with a large retail organization, and in the retail space, typically what you may have had to do is, you look at your employees at say the store or out in retail, where um, their tenure cycle is a lot different than say the back office,
Hmm.
or the distribution organization. But when you use machine learning, it's able to look at those features that go into a model and determine what elements are going to be the best to come up with that prediction, where in the past it would have required you to generate multiple models for those different segments. And that was that saves in the number of models that you have to create and maintain, and a much better result. And it was surprising that when we combined the data into one model, that the model knew, oh, okay, this person I'm evaluating differently because they're back office, and their tenure cycle is going to be different than say a field store operator or a store manager, which often has a much different cycle. So the AI models, it's amazing how it's able to look at those features and then drive a prediction based off of it. It's fascinating, and it saves on time and maintenance of supporting a model.
Absolutely. So, what is that process, Keith? As let's say you have an engagement with the organization, you first, I guess, agree on the scope, and then let's say you've already dealt with that data integration hurdle. What's next?
Yeah, so you pretty much broken down the first part pretty well. I mean, I would say that there's that business case that you start out with to understand, not just the data that you're going to use, but how are you going to use that output. And sometimes I almost work with people to challenge them and say, up front, look at possible ways to stop and move on to something else, because you're going into a difficult and a process that's going to be somewhat challenging. So make sure up front you have a good
Hmm.
outcome, and a good way you're going to value this. So to answer your question, you're really now talking, you've done that business aspect, you've gotten some data together, you want to go through that model generation. um, it's finding good platforms like R or Python to be able to work with, and of course, good models. And there's a lot of algorithms out there that are open source that you can work with. It just requires you to get your data prepared. Typically, if you're looking at employee records, you want one employee record that sums up things over time, like the number of jobs they held, the promotions, demotions, the average pay over time, things like that, so that you have that one record to go into that model with the final outcome that you're looking for. Did they stay or did they go? Were they a good hire? Were they not a good hire? So it's going to take that information and then generate a prediction. And then you compare that prediction to your actual data set to see, was this a good prediction? Did it match what actually happened? And then when, if it does, and if it's in a close range, you can use that model again for another set of population. And you can be fairly confident that prediction is going to be accurate. So that's kind of the process of building that model and validating it. Of course, then looking for any types of biases that we talked about before. And then finally taking that prediction and mapping it to something that's readable and displayed into reports or dashboards that users can then gain access to. Those are, if you do all that work and you can't get that information out to people that are going to be able to utilize it, that's keeping that in the back of the mind in terms of when you're going into it is really important.
And ongoing, who's maintaining that? Who's maybe having a review every now, once in a while to kind of see if everything is still on track? Do we need to maybe put in new data in, feed it like a new data source, making sure that it's still working the way that we thought it was working initially?
Yeah, George, I can see you've done this before. You've seen it. So obviously, that's key. From a usability perspective, you're looking at your field managers and your HRBPs out there that are using this data. Typically, in our process, in our experience, we're seeing that the retraining of a model is typically done yearly or twice yearly. So you're regathering that data again, retraining the model. And that's just something that's built into the maintenance of your model. So it would be similar types of people that were used to initially generate the model. The only difference is you're getting a new data set, running it through the model and analyzing it to make sure it's valid and for biases. So the amount of time is a lot different than the initial setup of the model.
Right.
And it's usually within the HR or HR using a vendor to help support that.
Thank you. So do you have any advice for organizations and the HR departments looking to adopt these predictive models? What best practices would you offer to ensure that successful implementation and successful utilization?
Yeah, I do. I think, again, it starts with, understanding how, if you could wave that magic wand and automatically you had this prediction, how are you going to use that? How are you going to display it? And how are you going to get it out to the people? Because if there isn't that foundation, or if there isn't that process built in, then I would say, okay, move on to something else. But, thinking about what that final output is going to look like and how it's going to add value to organization. If it's not adding value, move on to something else. So that, I would say, is probably key. And then second is be ready for a little bit of a challenge to get data and get data prepared. Again, it's siloed, it's across different systems. You're going to have to bring that together. And that's a little bit of a lift. And then thirdly, I think the model generation and the model aspect, there's a lot of help out there. There's a lot of great open source out there. There's people that can help you with that. So often people think that's the primary challenge. And I think that challenge is actually becoming minimal. Working with vendors, working with open source, that challenge can actually get smaller. It's those other things afterwards I think people need to understand.
I'm very glad to hear that, because then it seems that the future is more attainable and it's actually here. We can do that now.
Yep,
Well, thank you so
absolutely.
much, Keith, for being the Lights on Data show and putting the lights on the future of work, predictive models in HR analytics. I do encourage people to follow Keith Goode on LinkedIn and check out ZeroedIn.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm always happy, as you can tell, to carry on this conversation. I think there's a lot of value that can be gained. And my handle on LinkedIn is Keith A. Goode. So feel free to reach out. I'd love to carry on the conversation.
Thank you so much, Keith. That's very generous.
Thanks, George.